Hi YouTube, welcome back. So as the intro suggests, we're going to talk about hets and trying to understand how they work. Now, commonly, the term hets is used to describe recessive genes, or an animal that carries the trait for a recessive gene. So as you can see here, I've got a het pied and a pastel pied. Now the pied, as most of us will know, is the animal that has a lot of the white coloration with a bit of pattern. In order to produce that animal, you either need two piebalds or 200% het piebalds, and we'll go a little bit more into that in a minute. So common recessives are things like clown, monarch, albino and sunset, and like we said, pied. So in the hobby we hear the term hets. This usually refers to recessive genes such as clown, monarch, albino and sunset. So the term het is usually referring to recessive mutations. So like we've already seen, clown, monarch, albino, sunset, pied and a bunch of others. But really, the heterozygous condition is not exclusive to recessives, as it applies to any situation where two non-alike alleles are present. I'll do another video where we talk about alleles and allelic combinations. Pastels and all other single expression codominant morphs are heterozygous in actual fact. So there are some things that are named het which aren't het. So het red xanthic is a classical example of this. So I've got a few diagrams to try and explain, when you do your pairings, how the hets work with normals and with visuals. So this diagram here is using a outcome chart, if you like, of all possible pairings. So like it says at the top here, the first one, if you pair a het to a normal, the resulting offspring are considered 50% possible hets. So from a 4-egg clutch, you should end up, according to the odds, with 2 het for the visual, in this case albino, and 2 normals. Sometimes you could have all hets, sometimes you might not have any hets. So it's worth bearing that in mind. But the odds state that you should have, in a 4-egg clutch, 2 het albinos and 2 normals. We go further down and we pair a het to a het. Now this is all these hets in this is referring to 100% hets. So if we was to put a het to a het, you should get what's known as 66% possible hets. So your outcomes in a 1 in 4 clutch is 1 visual, 2 hets and 1 normal. Again, this isn't always the case. You might get 2 visuals, you might get 3 visuals, you might get 4 visuals, you might get all hets and you might get all normals. It starts to get interesting when you start introducing visual. So if you put a visual or homozygous to a normal, then everything will be 100% hets, because they contain 1 copy of the albino gene, which is in this one here. And if you put a homozygous to a het, so that's a visual to a het, everything will carry the gene, but the visuals will have 2 copies, so they will be visual because of the 2 copies, and the animals that have 1 copy will be the hets. So you should end up on this outcome 50-50 hets and visuals. And if you put a visual to a visual, everything will be visual. So like I said, Hets don't only apply to recessives. So if we look at, say, a pastel, so a pastel jungle in this scenario, so a pastel has a super form. So because it has a super form, the single gene acts as a het effectively. So in this case, if we put the pastel to a normal, you should end up with 2 pastels and 2 normals. Excuse me. So again, these in the recessive diagram like this, these would be the hets. So you get 2 pastels and 2 normals. If you put a pastel to a pastel, your outcome should be 2 pastels, 1 super pastel, and a normal. And again, if you put a super pastel to a normal, you should end up with all pastels, because don't forget the super form, or in the case of recessive, the recessives, the one parent can only pass on one gene. They can't pass on both. So if you was to put a super pastel to a pastel, then you should end up with a 50-50 clutch. So a couple of pastels and a couple of super pastels. And if you put a super pastel to a super pastel, you will end up with all super pastels. I hope I've explained this so that it's understandable. Feel free to comment and ask any questions, and I'll try and answer the questions better than what I've made the video. But yeah, so that is in a nutshell how to kind of understand hets and how they would work in your pairings. Thanks for watching. If you want to see more content, subscribe to my channel, give us a like, and hit the notifications button. Thank you.